8 combat veterans, 11 Purple Hearts between them, 3 of the Army's most decorated non-commissioned officers from 2 separate theaters of war. And for 61 days, not one of them had said a single voluntary word to any doctor, nurse, social worker, or chaplain assigned to Ward 12 at the Harmon Veterans Transitional Care Facility in Billings, Montana. Then a maintenance worker named Cass Merrow walked in carrying a mop bucket and a paper bag lunch, and by the time she reached the far end of the ward, 4 of those men had turned their chairs to face her direction. Not toward her exactly, just away from the wall they'd been staring at, which, as Dr. Celeste Hahn would later tell the Regional Oversight Board, was the first directional movement any of them had made in 3 weeks that wasn't toward a door. Nobody paid attention to the maintenance worker. That was the point. The background the facility had on Cass Merrow was thin enough to read in 40 seconds. 32 years old. Army Medical Corps separated 8 years ago, associate's credential in hospital operations earned at a community college in Missoula after her discharge. She'd applied for a custodial opening that Harmon had posted twice without filling it, showed up on time, passed the background check, and started on a Tuesday. Her hair was pulled back. She wore gray facility scrubs under a fleece vest. She had a way of moving through a space that was neither fast nor slow, and that the younger orderlies on Ward 12 couldn't quite describe except to say she didn't make the air feel tight the way most people did when they walked into that room. Ward 12 had been making the air tight for a long time. The 8 men assigned there had arrived in staggered groups over the previous 4 months, transferred from acute care at Bethesda and Fort Campbell, and one from a private hospital in Phoenix where his family had run out of options. Their diagnoses were documented. Their histories were documented. The specific shape of what had been done to them, what they had done, what they had survived, was documented in files that filled 3 folders each, and that the Harmon clinical staff read carefully and then sat with in a particular kind of silence before going about their work. The problem was that documented didn't mean reachable. 3 therapists had attempted standard trauma protocol over the preceding 2 months. 2 had requested reassignment. The third, a 26-year-old named Tyson Welk, who had been working trauma care for 11 months, and who the senior staff quietly agreed was too young for this particular assignment, but who had volunteered and been allowed, had been sitting outside room 14 twice daily for the past 3 weeks, running what he called passive presence sessions, which meant he brought a chair and a thermos of coffee and sat in the open doorway for 40 minutes at a stretch without speaking. He had not been hurt. He had also not made contact. He showed up because he didn't know what else to do, and because the alternative was to write up a formal recommendation for involuntary psychiatric escalation, and the man inside room 14, Staff Sergeant Burl Kettle, 61 years old, 34 years of service, 2 deployments to Iraq, 1 to Afghanistan, had not done anything that met the clinical threshold for escalation. He just stopped talking, stopped eating reliably, stopped looking at anyone who came through the door in a way that suggested he expected them to be real. The facility director, a man named Philip Stout, had a different name for what was happening in Ward 12. He called it a resource optimization gap. The trauma support contract that had provided 2 additional behavioral specialists and a peer counselor with prior combat experience had been discontinued 3 months ago as part of what Stout described in the budget memo as a service delivery restructuring. The restructuring had saved the facility $14,000 annually. Stout had noted in the same memo that the peer counselor position in particular offered unclear clinical value relative to its cost. $14,000. Dr. Hahn had that figure committed to memory, the way people memorize things they expect to need in court. She was standing outside Ward 12 at 7:45 in the morning, 17 pages into a staffing appeal she'd already filed twice without response, when Cass Merrow came down the corridor pushing the supply cart. Hahn watched her stop outside the ward entrance, check the posted cleaning schedule, and then do something Hahn didn't immediately understand. She stood outside the door for approximately 30 seconds without moving, her hand on the cart, her eyes toward the floor, before she pushed the door open and went in. Hahn watched through the door's narrow window. The ward common room held 5 of the 8 men at that hour. 2 at the window table. 1 on the couch with his face turned toward the back cushions. 2 in chairs positioned to face nothing in particular. None of them looked up when the door opened, which was normal. They had stopped registering doors opening months ago. Cass Merrow moved to the corner with the supply closet and began restocking it. She made no special effort to be quiet. She also made no special effort to be noticed. She simply worked, moved things from cart to shelf, checked expiration dates, rolled a floor mat to the opposite wall. At the 7-minute mark, the man by the back window turned his head. At the 12-minute mark, the 2 at the table had adjusted their chairs 40 degrees. At the 20-minute mark, the man on the couch had pushed himself upright and was sitting with his back against the cushions and his eyes open, which Han had not seen from him in 9 days. She called Sergeant Major Byron Ladd, who ran the facility's Veterans Services Coordination, from the hallway with her back against the wall because she didn't want her face visible through the window. "You need to come to Ward 12, she said. "Now don't run. Walk normal." Ladd appeared from the administrative wing 4 minutes later. He was 51, with the kind of face that years in the army had made into something spare and economical, and he looked at Han the way he looked at most unexpected things, which was with careful attention and no visible reaction. He looked through the window. He looked for a long time. "Who is she?" he said finally. "Maintenance staff. Started last week." Han was watching the room over his shoulder. "She's been in there 23 minutes. And they haven't. No. Ladd watched Cass move a mop across the tile in the far corner, systematic and unhurried. The man who'd been facing the couch cushions was now watching her. His hands were in his lap. His shoulders had dropped 2 inches from where they'd been when Ladd first looked through the glass. "What's she doing differently?" Ladd said. "I don't know yet," Han said, "but I'm going to find out." She found her in the supply corridor on the way to Ward 10. "Miss Merrow." Cass stopped the cart. She turned and looked at Han with an expression that Han would later describe as the opposite of defensive. It wasn't open exactly, more like present, fully, completely present in a way that most people weren't, particularly in hallways outside trauma wards. "Doctor," Cass said, "I was watching you in Ward 12 this morning." Cass waited. "The men in that ward haven't responded to clinical staff in weeks. You've been working for 11 days, and they turned their chairs." "I wasn't trying to get a response," Cass said. "I know. That's what I want to ask you about." Cass looked at her cart, then back at Han. There was a pause that lasted 3 seconds, which Han understood in the way you understand things after 15 years in trauma medicine, as someone deciding how much to say. "I've been around people who've seen a lot," Cass said carefully. "You learn that the worst thing you can do when someone's carrying something that heavy is to walk into their space like you want something from them. They can feel it. Every single time." She paused. "I wasn't asking them for anything. That's the whole difference." Han looked at her for a moment. "What's your background?" "Medical Corps, 8 years ago. A beat. I'd rather show you than explain it." Ladd found her 3 days later. He waited until she'd finished the ward rotation and caught her at the staff break room off the East Corridor, because the East Corridor had no cameras, which he'd checked in advance, which told Cass something about Ladd's professional habits when she noticed it, though she didn't say so. He sat down across from her without preamble. "I pulled what I could on your service record," he said, "which wasn't much." "Probably not," she agreed. "Medical Corps designation, correct. But the deployment records." He stopped. "There aren't any. Or there are, but they're behind a classification code I've only seen once before." Cass drank her coffee. "I'm not asking you to compromise anything," Ladd said. "I'm asking because Burlkettle hasn't eaten a voluntary meal in 4 days. And Han is 3 weeks from a forced escalation recommendation she doesn't want to make and doesn't believe will help." His jaw tightened slightly. "And whatever you're doing in that ward is working, which means you know something the rest of us don't." "I know some things," Cass said. "What kind?" "Field medicine. The kind that happens when a handler goes down and the team keeps moving anyway, When the mission doesn't stop because somebody's starting to come apart, she looked at the table. You figure out pretty quickly that clinical protocol is built for clinics. In the field, you have 10 seconds to read someone and 5 to decide how to approach, and if you get it wrong, people die. She looked up at him. I got good at not getting it wrong. Lad was quiet for a moment. What branch? She almost smiled, the kind that doesn't answer that. He didn't push. He'd spent 3 decades in the Army, and he knew the shape of certain silences the way you know the shape of a room you've walked through in the dark. Stout is going to be a problem, he said instead. He already is, she said. I've seen the ward logs. 4 ignored clinical recommendations in 8 weeks. The peer counselor position he cut was the only one with combat experience. That's not a budget decision. That's a choice. Lad looked at her carefully. You read the budget documentation. I have clearance to access anything in this facility as janitorial staff, she said. You'd be surprised what ends up in recycling bins. He stared at her for a moment, then very quietly, what do you need? She told him. It wasn't much on its face. Access to the ward on her own schedule, not the posted rotation. An understanding from Han that whatever she was doing wouldn't be interrupted by clinical check-ins, and Lad himself available on a radio channel she'd specify. Why the radio? He said. Because this is going to work until it doesn't, she said. And when it doesn't, I'll need someone who moves fast. She was right about the timeline, just wrong about who moved fast. It was 11 days later. Cass had been coming to Ward 12 twice daily, morning and late afternoon, always at the same times, always through the same entrance, always starting in the supply corner before doing anything else. She didn't speak to the men unless they spoke first. She didn't make eye contact unless it was offered. She brought the same thermos every day and set it on the same shelf, open. Not because she was doing anything intentional with the smell of coffee specifically, but because Lad had told her that 3 of the 8 men had grown up in households that smelled like it, and because comfort is mostly architecture built from familiar things. On the 9th day, Staff Sergeant Burl Kettle had come out of room 14 and stood in the doorway of the common room for the first time in 37 days. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't come any further into the room. He'd stood in the doorway for 6 minutes while Cass worked the far wall, not looking at him, and then he'd gone back inside. Lad had seen it from the corridor window. He'd texted Han one word, 6 minutes. On the 11th day, Stout called Cass into his office. He was 58, with the administrative posture of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where his authority was the only authority that mattered. He looked at her the way he looked at most things that inconvenienced him, as if the inconvenience were a category error she'd made. I've been informed that you've been accessing Ward 12 outside your scheduled rotation, he said. I have, Cass said. The ward has a clinical access protocol. Janitorial staff are assigned specific windows. I'm aware. Then you understand why what you've been doing is a problem. He folded his hands. These are medically complex patients. Unauthorized access by non-clinical staff creates liability and disrupts the care environment. Cass looked at him. Her face was neutral in the way that Lad, watching from outside the glass panel in the office door, had come to recognize as her actual working expression. Not angry. Not apologetic, just there. Burl Kettle came out of his room for the first time in 5 weeks 3 days ago, she said. He stood in the common room for 6 minutes. Yesterday morning he ate half of a meal tray that I left on the supply cart by mistake. She paused. It wasn't a mistake. Stout's expression did something complicated. You are not clinical staff, he said. No. You have no authority to design or administer care protocols. I haven't administered anything. I've been cleaning the ward and leaving a thermos of coffee on the same shelf every morning. And you've been, he gestured, doing whatever it is you're apparently doing that my trained clinical team has failed to do in 60 days, which frankly raises questions I find more uncomfortable than your scheduling violations. His voice had shifted into something flatter. I need you to return to your assigned rotation, effective today. Lad had his hand on the door handle when Cass said, quietly, the peer counselor position you eliminated. What was the stated rationale? Stout went very still. That's not your concern. The budget memo said unclear clinical value, Cass said. Raymond Oths had 11 years of peer support experience and 4 of his own deployments. You eliminated him from a ward with 8 combat veterans in acute crisis. A pause. That's not unclear clinical value. That's the clearest possible clinical value there is. The room went tight. Mrs. Merrow, Stout said very evenly, you will return to your assigned rotation. Do I need to have security walk you out? Cass picked up the canvas bag she'd brought in. You can ask me to leave, she said. That's your call. She looked at him levelly. But I'd suggest you wait until the end of the week and see what the ward looks like. Stout didn't wait until the end of the week. He called facility security at 2 in the afternoon, and by 2:15 Cass Merrow's keycard had been deactivated, and she was walking across the parking lot in the November cold with her thermos and her bag. Ladd watched her from the second-floor window. He stood there after she was gone for longer than he meant to. The feeling in his chest was the specific feeling of a person who has let the right thing walk out the door because the wrong person held the keys. He went back to Ward 12. The common room felt different. He couldn't have quantified it. The men were in the same positions, more or less. The light was the same. But something in the register of the space had changed. Not back to where it had been before Cass. Somewhere worse, actually. The way a room feels when something has been removed from it that wasn't supposed to be removed. Burl Kettle hadn't come out of room 14 all afternoon. Welk was outside the door again with his thermos. His face, when he looked up at Ladd, had the expression of a 26-year-old who was working very hard to stay composed. She left her thermos, Welk said. Ladd looked at the supply cart in the corner. The red thermos was on the second shelf, where it always was. He didn't say anything. His radio crackled 40 minutes later. The voice was Hahn's, and it did not have the flat clinical tone she used in emergencies. It had something sharper. Sergeant Major, room 14 now. He took the stairs. Burl Kettle was on the floor, not fallen, seated deliberately back against the bed frame. His breathing was wrong. His color was wrong. Welk was crouched 3 feet away, not touching him, hands visible, saying his name in the calm, repetitive way you say a name when you're not sure it's reaching anyone. Hahn was in the doorway. She looked at Ladd and said, very flat, I need Merrow. He was already dialing. She picked up on the first ring. Kettle, he said, he's in crisis. Could be cardiac, could be dissociative break, could be both. A breath. Hahn doesn't know what to do, and neither do I, and your access card is dead. The pause was half a second. I'll be there in 8 minutes, Cass said. Tell Hahn not to crowd him. No more than one person visible from his position. Keep the lights exactly where they are. Don't add anything. Don't turn anything off. And if he says anything at all, just say his rank back to him. Staff Sergeant. That's it. You're not credentialed here anymore. I know, she said. I'm coming anyway. She was there in 7. She didn't come through the front entrance. She came through the loading bay, where laundry carts moved in and out on an access Stout's security order hadn't covered because nobody had thought to specify it. She was carrying the hard-sided medical case that had been in her car. Not the canvas bag, the case. Ladd had never seen the case before, and he understood immediately that it was not an ER nurse's case. Where? She said. This way. Burl Kettle was still on the floor when they reached him. His eyes were open. His breathing had slowed from the worst of it, but it hadn't stabilized. He was doing something with his hands that Hahn had described in her notes as repetitive grounding behavior, pressing his palms flat against the floor, feeling the surface. Cass stopped at the door. She didn't go in immediately. She stood in the doorway for 6 full seconds with her hands at her sides, doing nothing. Then she sat down on the floor just inside the threshold, not close, not at arm's reach, just inside the plane of the room, and she set the case beside her, and she said, without performing anything, Staff Sergeant. Kettle's hands went still. Floor's cold, she said, conversational, ordinary. Hospital floors are always cold. I used to think they did that on purpose. Kettle looked at her. It was the first time, Welk would say afterward, that he'd seen the man look at something that wasn't a wall. My hands got used to it, Cass said. Took about a year of field work. Your hands don't care about cold after a while. They just register. Surface safe, solid. She put her own palm flat on the floor. That's what you're doing, making sure the floor is real. Kettle made a sound, not a word, but a sound. Something shifted in the room. Ladd, standing in the corridor with Han, did not move, neither did she. They stood in the hall and did not move because moving felt like it would break the only thing that had happened in this ward in 68 days. It took 40 minutes. Cass stayed on the floor the whole time. She talked in the intervals when talking seemed useful and was quiet in the intervals when it didn't. She opened the medical case twice, once to take Kettle's pulse at his wrist when he finally moved his arm near enough, and once to administer something she discussed with Han in a low voice over the radio that Han, afterward, noted in her log as appropriate and necessary and outside the standard formulary she had access to at the facility. When Kettle was stable enough to move to the bed, he said 4 words. They were not dramatic words. They were not the words anyone might have scripted for the moment. He looked at Cass, who was still sitting on the floor near him, and he said, "You been in it." It wasn't a question. She held his gaze. "Yeah," she said, "I've been in it." He nodded, slowly, like someone filing something away. He let Welk help him to the bed. He didn't tell Welk to leave. That was the first night Burl Kettle slept without waking before dawn since his admission. Stout arrived at 9 the next morning to find Ladd waiting outside his office with a chair positioned at an angle that indicated Ladd intended to be in the conversation whether Stout opened the door or not. "She re-entered the facility," Stout said, on revoked credentials. "On a loading bay access that was never modified in your security order," Ladd said. "I reviewed the language." A pause. "Burl Kettle is stable. His vitals are the best they've been since admission. 2 other men in the ward requested breakfast this morning for the first time in 3 weeks. That's not the point, Sergeant Major. With respect, sir, that is exactly the point." Ladd kept his voice the way he kept everything. Level, professional, carrying weight without broadcasting it. "You removed the only person in this facility who has made demonstrable progress with Ward 12 because she was accessing a ward outside a cleaning schedule. And last night, one of the men you're responsible for nearly died. He did not look away. I'll have the incident documentation to you by end of day. Full timeline." Stout's jaw tightened. "I want her out of this building." "She's already gone. She left at 11 last night when Kettle was stable." Ladd stood. "But there's a regional patient advocacy review scheduled for Thursday, Director. They received Dr. Hahn's appeal this morning. The 3rd one." He paused. "The one with the incident log attached." The color in Stout's face did something. Hahn filed. At 7 a.m. through the Federal Patient Safety Channel, which doesn't route through your desk. Ladd walked back to his office and called Colonel Adele Rusk at the Regional Veterans Care Oversight Office. He'd worked with Rusk twice before. She was efficient and had strong opinions about institutional negligence, and was the kind of officer who read incident logs in full rather than treating them as paperwork. She picked up on the second ring. He told her everything. What the regional review team found when they arrived Thursday morning was not, technically, a surprise to anyone who had been reading Hahn's quarterly reports. But reading something in an appeal and seeing it systematically documented across 47 pages of incident logs, ignored correspondence, and financial records was a different experience. The peer counselor position Stout had eliminated had been flagged as critical need in 2 separate clinical assessments before its termination. Stout's office had received both assessments, logged both as received, and generated no response. The $14,000 savings had been reallocated to a facilities renovation project that, under the auditor's review, had been funded from a separate budget line that had already been approved. There was no financial necessity for the reallocation. The auditor used the phrase "no legitimate basis identified." The team also found in a digitized archive from a records consolidation 6 months earlier a photograph that had been filed without anyone in Stout's office appearing to understand what it was. It showed a woman in field clothes in a location the photograph gave no identifying information about. She was younger, late 20s maybe. She was kneeling beside a man in tactical gear who was sitting against a rock outcrop with a wound at his shoulder that had been dressed in the field with materials that weren't standard issue. Her hands were on his face. He was looking at her. On the back of the photograph, visible in the scan, someone had written 3 words in blue marker. "You stayed anyway." The woman in the photograph was Cass Merrow. Ladd was in his office when the call came from Rusk's aide. He was not surprised that the photograph existed. He was not surprised that the service record behind it was longer and more complex than what Cass had given him. He had understood since the moment she said field medicine and said it the way she did that he was getting the edited version, and he had decided that the edited version was sufficient for what needed to happen. What he hadn't expected was the 15 years, not the 7 she'd mentioned, not even close to 7. He forwarded everything to Rusk without comment. Rusk called him back in 6 minutes. Her voice had the quality it had when she'd already made a decision and was verifying the last piece. "The classification on her record," she said. "You've seen the code?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you understand what that means?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you understand why the photograph being in a digitized base archive is a significant problem independent of everything else." "Understood." A pause. "Philip Stout is being placed on administrative leave pending formal review, effective today. I want a full documentation package from your office and Hans by Monday." Another pause, shorter. "And I want to know where Merrow is." Ladd looked at the window. Outside, the November sky was the flat white that came before a Montana snowstorm, heavy and low. "I'll find her," he said. He found her at the facility the next morning. She hadn't come to Ward 12. She was in the loading bay where the laundry carts moved through, sitting on an overturned supply bin in the cold, holding a cup of coffee in both hands the way she'd been holding it in the corridor 7 days ago when this had all started. He sat down on the bin beside her. "Stout's on administrative leave," he said. "Review team found irregular accounting, 4 ignored clinical recommendations, pattern going back further than the contract cut." He paused. "He's done." She drank her coffee. "The photograph," he said, "the one in the records archive." She looked at the far wall. "I know about the photograph." "Who wrote on the back?" She was quiet for a moment. "His name was Corporal Daniel Fenn. He was 23 years old. He gave me that photograph 2 days before a mission that doesn't have an official record." A pause. "He survived. He's in Oregon. He doesn't know any of this is happening." Ladd absorbed that. "Rusk wants to meet with you." "I figured." "She's not interested in pulling you back in," he said. Her words. "She's interested in the documentation gap and in making sure the breach gets handled correctly." He turned to look at her directly. "She's also interested in a formal consultation position, program development. Building out the trauma approach you've been using into a trainable curriculum for VA care facilities across the region." Cass looked at her coffee cup. "Real work," he said. "Documented, your name on the methodology." "My name on everything is new," she said. "It wasn't bitter. It was just true." Rusk also said. He stopped. "Chose how to continue. Your full service record, all 15 years. It's being moved toward formal recognition. The operations you were part of have been closed. The classification review was completed 8 months ago. The determination to keep the record sealed was made before anyone anticipated the document breach." She went very still, not the managed stillness she used when she was working, the other kind. "Recognition meaning what exactly?" she said. "Meaning your commendations are on your record, your deployments are on your record, your name is in the right place." He paused. "All of it, in the open." The loading bay was cold and functional and had no drama in it, which was probably why she'd been sitting there instead of somewhere else. She looked at the concrete floor for a long moment, then she looked up. "Burl Kettle," she said. "What's his status this morning?" "Ate a full breakfast. Talked to Welk for 12 minutes. Ladd paused. He asked where the thermos went. Something moved across her face, real, brief, there and gone. "Same shelf," she said. "Red thermos, second shelf, every morning, same time." "I told Welk." She stood up. She shouldered the canvas bag. She looked at Ladd with the straight reading look she had that didn't perform anything. "The curriculum," she said. "If I build it, the handlers get input. not just the supervisors. The people in the rooms every day, their feedback gets incorporated into every revision cycle. That's not negotiable. I'll put it in the request to Rusk. And I want to see each ward's individual documentation before I design anything. What works for Kettle doesn't work for everyone. You can't protocol this from the outside in. Agreed. She looked at him for a moment. You wrote a job description, she said. Around me. I wrote it accurately, he said. She shook her head slowly, but there was something in her face that hadn't been there before, or that had been there all week and was only now visible. The version of her without all the management. The one that existed under 15 years of operating in places that had no official record and left no traceable path. I'll think about it, she said. I know you will, he said. That was Wednesday. On Friday, Rusk's formal consultation approval came through. Ladd printed it and put it on the supply cart in Ward 12 with a note that said, in his handwriting exactly one line, same shelf. Cass was in the ward common room with 3 of the men when he brought it. They were playing cards, not competitively. Just playing, the way people who have stopped asking anything of each other sometimes find their way to the same table. She looked at the paper, she read it. She folded it and put it in her vest pocket. Later, when the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in Montana in November, cutting low and gold through the window and across the floor, Ladd walked her to the framed mission statement on the wall outside Ward 12, the one that listed the facility's commitments in the formal language of institutional documentation. Below it, someone had mounted a smaller frame, new. The glass was still clean. Inside was a printed citation. It used the careful language of official records, the kind that couldn't be sealed and couldn't be redacted and wasn't going anywhere. It described the behavioral approach developed for Ward 12, its methodology, its outcomes. At the bottom, in the standard line for authorship, it read, developed by Cass Merrow, consulting specialist, in partnership with Harmon Veterans Care clinical staff. She stood in front of it for a while. Ladd stood beside her and said nothing because there wasn't anything to say. She took the pen off the check-in clipboard on the wall. She signed her name in the day's visitor log, the ordinary, daily, unremarkable visitor log that hundreds of people signed without thinking about it. She held the pen a second after she signed. It was her name, her real name, in a real building, on a real document, in a place where the work she'd done was described on the wall above it, and the men she'd reached were alive and eating breakfast down the hall. She set the pen back on the clipboard. Same time tomorrow, she said. Same time tomorrow, Ladd said. And there is something worth sitting with in how small that is, how ordinary. No ceremony, no speech, no moment where the music swells at the right time. Just a woman who spent 15 years doing necessary work in places that had no name for what she was, finally standing in a lit hallway with her name on the wall, saying yes to the next morning. The world doesn't often produce the clean vindication. The people who deserved recognition decades ago don't always get it while it still feels whole. But sometimes, not always, not neatly, not without the cost of everything that came before, sometimes the record gets corrected. Sometimes the person who was written off as just another custodial hire, just a scheduling problem, just someone's inconvenient presence in a ward she wasn't authorized to be in, sometimes that person gets to put their name on something and have it mean exactly what it says. Cass Merrow walked back into Ward 12 for her first official day of work, and Burl Kettle was in the common room with the others, and when he saw her come through the door, he lifted 2 fingers off the arm of his chair in a gesture that anyone who hadn't spent years in military service would have missed entirely. She raised 2 fingers back. The morning light came through the windows low and clear, and the mountains south of Billings were sharp against a sky, the color of something just beginning, and none of it was perfect, and all of it was enough.